Thank you to everyone here for being a part of this live event and to those viewing this recording. It's always nice to see familiar and new faces joining us. Our community is growing and I'm so grateful to all of you for showing your support time and time again. And as always, I got to give a shout out to my amazing and beautiful parents, Eddie and Lori, who are the best and most supportive people I know and are always there for me and always here for these events. And thank you to all of the survivors and their families, especially Bernice Lerner, daughter of Ruth Mermelstein, born Rachel Ruth, who will be sharing her mother's testimony with us today. Welcome to 2G Tuesdays, a program that brings children of Holocaust survivors and their testimonies to people all over the world. My name is Michael Mantell. I'm a psychotherapist and educator and 3G, a grandchild of Holocaust survivors. With the rise of Jew hatred, I found myself feeling trapped in conversations, arguing with people who consciously or unconsciously hate Jews. One example is when sharing resources during a Holocaust Remembrance Day in a group of mental health professionals and students, the conversation quickly devolved into an attack on Jews, including the accusation that Jews use the Holocaust narrative to oppress and kill others. It sparked an idea for me to produce and host Holocaust education program and do work that promotes Jewish pride and combats Jew hatred. I started the first Sundays with Survivors program in October 2020, which featured Holocaust survivors sharing their testimonies. It began as a one-time private event for friends and family, and it was so successful that we opened it up to the public and added more events. In 2021, following the success of Sundays with Survivors, I added this great program, 2G Tuesdays. These programs have featured dozens of Holocaust survivors and their family members, have reached thousands of people all over the world, and raised so far $30,000 to support Holocaust education. I'm so grateful that we've been going 3 years strong and counting. And this year I'm excited that we'll be adding 3G Thursdays to the mix. Since starting these programs, I've also been fortunate enough to contribute to other programs that promote Holocaust education and combat Jew hatred. I was featured on a TV news segment, co-wrote and contributed to articles and appeared on panels about Holocaust education and combating Jew hatred in general and on college campuses. I've created fundraising programs that engage communities and promote Jewish pride, initiated a support group for Jewish therapists, started a chapter for alum to combat Jew hatred at my alma mater, and was part of an initiative to bring a Title VI complaint against my alma mater, which is now in an open investigation. But most importantly, I've made connections with survivors, their families, and this incredible community. My grandfather, Mickey Mendelovich, passed away before I was born, and my grandmother, Alice Diamond, in 2008. But these programs and the connections that I've made with all of you help me connect with them, remember them, and make sure that their lives and the lives of all survivors and families are never forgotten. Today, we are fortunate to be joined by Bernice Lerner, who will be sharing her mother's testimony today. Her mother, Ruth, passed away in October 2022. I've had the great honor of having Ruth on the Sundays with Survivors program 2 years ago and had the chance to get to know her a little bit more as well. Ruth and my grandfather were both from Seagate, and speaking with Ruth reminded me of my grandmother. And I'm grateful that Bernice will be joining us today. Bernice Lerner is the author of All the Horrors of War, A Jewish Girl, a British Doctor, and the Liberation of Bergen-Belsen, and other writings on the Holocaust and on virtue ethics. Before and after, she served as director of Boston University's Center for Character and Social Responsibility, where she's now a senior scholar. Bernice worked at Hebrew College, most recently as Dean of Adult Learning. All told, she has more than 25 years of experience in the field of adult education. Bernice has lectured widely and in various settings, including at a university in Indonesia, the Ministry of Education in Singapore, and the University of Hiroshima in Japan. Stateside, she has given presentations at numerous conferences and addressed faculty and staff of both private and public schools. Among courses she taught at Boston University were resistance during the Holocaust and character and ethics education. She also designed and taught ethical decision-making for education leaders for Northeastern University's College of Professional Studies. Following the presentation, we will open the program for Q&A. As I always say, no matter how incredible these programs are, and trust me, they always are, the Q&A portion makes it even more meaningful. It's a time for all of us to interact, ask questions, and share our own experiences. And during that time, please feel free to raise your virtual hand by using their hand raised emoji, type your questions or comments in the chat box for me to share for you, or unmute yourself to speak. And just 2 more announcements. Please save the date for the next Sundays with Survivors program featuring Evelyn Appel, scheduled for Sunday, March 10th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And for this program, I will be spotlighting the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis, the organization also known as CAMERA. CAMERA does incredible work correcting distortions, inaccuracies, and lies in the media, and has done a wonderful job of combating Jew hatred on college campuses. I will be sharing a link to camera.org after the program so that you can all donate to support their great work as well. And with all of that, I thank you and I welcome Bernice.
Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you for doing this work and for inviting me to join in this program this evening. And thank you for everyone who is here, who attended. There's so many things to choose to do, so I'm honored that you're with us. So I'm happy to talk about my mom's testimony. It was very sad when I lost her last year. During the time that I was writing this book about her, I was very blessed to have her with me. I could ask her questions. She was of the mindset that I could ask her anything, anytime, which really enabled me ultimately to tell her story. So what you see here in this slide are 2 book covers. The one on the left is the US version, published by Johns Hopkins, and the one on the right was published at the same time in the UK. And you could see that they had the same images but very different concepts. The content is the same in both books. But I wanted to show you both because the pictures tell a story, and combined you get a fuller picture. So the one on the right, To Meet in Hell, you can see my mother in full form. And this is about 7 months after the war's end. Her black and blue marks, her wounds have mostly healed. You can see that she's well nourished. She's not smiling. She's kind of depressed. She's orphaned. She had just turned 16 years old, and she is very sick with tuberculosis. And on the top left, that is the actual background of the photograph, which was a tuberculosis sanitarium in snowy northwest Sweden. And the bottom of that image is of Glenn Hughes, and he was the character I initially set out to write about. I had not intended at the outset to write my mother's story. I became interested in the question of how precisely she survived. Like, why am I here? Like, what were the mechanics of rescue and who was in charge? And I came across, if you Google the Liberation of Bergen-Belsen, which is where my mother was at the end of the war, the name Glenn Hughes comes up pretty quickly. So I set out exploring who this man was, and I determined that there was no biography written of him, no film about him, but he was as worthy as, let's say, an Oskar Schindler of the world's attention. He happened upon the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. He was at that time deputy director of medical services for the entire British Second Army, and he was in charge of the rescue he was a stalwart for preparedness, really a great administrator, on charge of all these units, casualty clearing stations, assistant deputy directors of medical services, and they were waging a war in Northwest Germany, and it was a total shock to come upon this concentration camp where there were 55 to 60,000 human beings in a very bad shape. And he barely had any personnel, and he had to make certain decisions. So you can see this picture is of him. Here you can see how startled he is by the photographer. Here he is in his caravan somewhere near Bergen-Belsen, and he could have been working on I don't know, 5 diets for people in 5 different stages of emaciation, or he could be corralling help from wherever he could. He was very high in the hierarchy, and the odds of him having met my mother were probably 0. Although had I written a work of fiction, I could have probably made this more of a romantic kind of story. But anyway, their lives converged in this hell. So here I was writing this story, first about the brigadier, and then somewhere along the line, I decided to also tell my mother's story, sort of divorcing myself from the fact that she was my mother and looking at her as if she's like this little kid. Like, what did she go through as an 11 through 16-year-old? Like, what was the experience of the war like through the lens of this very young teenager? And so that really helped me, set me apart and helped me to sort of try to view who she was objectively. And again, I had all her amazing stories that I could tell. But when I decided to write about her, I could not let go of the brigadier. So I decided that what I was going to do was write the book as a race against time rescue story, because the story of the Holocaust and what people went through, I realized could not be separated from what was going on in the war at large, what was happening. Why were people being moved to different places and what was going on in the bigger picture? So I decided to focus on the last year of the war. So the meat of my book is really the 4 seasons from the spring of 1944 to the spring, summer, fall, winter, and then the 5th season, the point at which my protagonists converge in Northwest Germany in Bergen-Belsen. So that is the meat of the book. Where is he? Where is she? What's happening? And of course, this race against time rescue story was lost for so many of those who were who were lucky enough to evade the gas chambers at Auschwitz, strong enough to survive slave labor camps and death marches, and wound up being dumped in this hell that was not ready to receive them. Just all these people converged in Bergen-Belsen, which was the largest Nazi concentration camp at the war's end. So the book is sandwiched in between some significant facts about the Belsen trial, sort of to set the stage, map things out. This trial was held immediately preceding the Nuremberg trials. It was the first trial to apply international law to war crimes. And here, this is an image from Army Talks magazine in November 1945. You see the dock where the defendants, there's 45 Nazi SS officers that are put on trial. I talk a little bit about them in the beginning and toward the end of my book. And it was quite a dramatic scene. It was in this courtroom, makeshift gymnasium in Lüneburg, Germany, and it got tremendous press coverage. And one thing that was really significant to me was Glenn Hughes was the first witness. So as the first witness, he set the tone of the trial and what it would be like. And there's a lot of other firsts that happened at this trial. But just to give you a sense, there were 45 Nazi officers brought to trial, but there were something like 480 Nazi functionaries in Bergen-Belsen. So most of them, the vast majority of them, got off scot-free. There were about 80 remaining in the camp at the time of the liberation for the extraordinary handover of this dump, this like cesspool of a place, from the German army to the British army. And it was handed over in a very strange story, truth is stranger than fiction kind of story, 3 weeks before the end of the war. And it was such a race against time that had the British army come in 1 or 2 days later, or a few days later, I would not be here to give you this presentation. There were so many people on the verge of death. And of course, so many people who still died for weeks after the liberation. There was no food or water for the last few days. There were diseases, there were at least 3 epidemics raging. People were so sick and dying by the droves. I further sandwiched the book between a prologue and an epilogue where I get to tell some significant backstory, both about my mother and Glenn Hughes before the war and after the war, what became of them. And in the Brigadier's case, what did he do with this knowledge and this experience that he had? And what became of my mother? So a little bit the prologue and the epilogue. And this is just a map. I'm not going to, normally when I give presentations, I talk about a few like stops along the way from the Yorkshire Wolds in Northern England and from Siget here, the Brigadier's journey, my mother's journey, and how they both wound up in this place. But I can tell you, I can tell you that if you were interested in all this detail, there's a lot of the presentations I've given have been videotaped and they're on YouTube. So I'm going to stop the share now. And Michael, I'm happy to be in conversation with you.
Well, thank you. Thanks for doing that introduction to your book. When I read the book, it read almost like a movie. So when you talk about this race against time, it felt like that. What I didn't know is that it was originally not about your mother. I thought you wrote a book intending to write your mother's testimony. And I had a question because you wrote a book before this, correct?
Yes.
It was about, I believe, 7 Holocaust survivors.
Yes.
So I
Yes.
was wondering, was this a conscious decision, at least, to not write about your mother, that you were writing about other survivors, and at this point you were writing about Glenn Hughes?
Yes. So my first book um, was, it started off as a dissertation.
Mm.
I was at the School of Education at Boston University, and the dean and my professors really convinced me that I had to do something related to my background, the Holocaust. So I decided to write a dissertation about 7 Holocausts. I actually wrote about 8, but one got cut out of the book. But I wrote about these survivors who became academics, who earned terminal degrees after the war. The question is, how do you advance so much academically, having missed so many years of schooling? Like, who were these people? And it was wonderful. It was also, for me, in a way, it was a race against time, because the survivors, right, they were dying, they're older, and how was I going to find these people and interview them? And I was limited. I couldn't travel all over the world, but being that I live in Boston, which is an academic hub, I was able to identify and make my way in to meet with these people and interview them and talk about their journeys. And it was really fascinating for me because it gave me, I got deep into the history of the places where they were from and the forces to which they were subjected. So I learned about what happened in France and Lithuania and Germany and Poland and Hungary. They were all from different parts of Europe, Nazi occupied Europe. And of course, I fell in love with my subjects. So it was a conscious choice then, because first of all, my parents they were not in that sort of category, right? Nobody in my family became an academic. My parents barely had education and they were business people. Everyone in my family was more or less in business. So they weren't teaching, they weren't doctors, they weren't philosophers, they weren't scientists, they were business people. So this introduced me to a different type of survivor. And I wasn't going to write about my mother. It hadn't occurred to me, because whenever I did little essays and things, but it was too close. It's kind of like painful to kind of imagine. And I decided I wanted to write about when I discovered Glenn Hughes, and I discovered what a person he was, how he was really had this soul turning experience after liberating the survivors, became great friends with the survivors, became their champion, and became a Zionist, and saw his role in the history of the Jewish people. And this was totally against British officialdom at the time. I mean, who knows what it cost him to really champion the survivors. I thought he deserved to be elevated and lifted into bold relief. And only after people were like, oh, but your mother's story is so interesting and you have to tell your mother's story, did I try to think of a way to delve into her past. And that was by, I was able to do it by, again, separating myself out and trying to look at her as this kid. And she was really quite a fascinating subject, right? She was younger than Anne Frank, but she was of a very different background than Anne Frank. Anne Frank was more, had a more privileged, comfortable pre-war life. My mother had a hard scrabble childhood. She was poor. She had a lot of responsibility. So anyway, she became like a fascinating character to me, and that's how I came to write about her.
You wove it in so perfectly that I assumed that this was your mother's story, and you used another perspective to tell it. So I was wrong with that, but it was so beautiful and just seemed so natural.
Thank you.
Definitely encourage the book, and I share the name of the book on the chat so people can see The Triumph of Wounded Souls, 7 Holocaust Survivors' Lives. So it's pretty incredible. I was wondering, what were some of the things you learned from your writings that you didn't know before, either in general about survivors, about humanity, about life, but also about your mother, and your father is also a survivor, correct?
Yes.
So what did you learn from doing your own research and then writing these books just in general about the Holocaust, about your family, about yourself?
So first of all, one, I don't know if I realized this before, but one thing is that people think of the liberation, that there's a lot of misunderstanding. It was so complex. It wasn't like, oh, the liberators came in, the sun is shining, the sky is blue. It's like, it was very complicated. And as one survivor said, so show us the sun, but slowly. And I didn't realize until really I was deep into the writing how difficult it was for my mother to sort of come back to life. She was in and out of tuberculosis sanitariums for 10 years in Sweden. And so she didn't get married. She was a kid, right? At the end of the war, she was 15. She didn't get married until like 11 years later, which was a good thing in a way for me, because a lot of, there was a big baby boom after the war, right? People had lost so much, but they were looking to couple, and to, there was such resilience among the mourners, right? They grew grieving. While they were grieving, they were trying to create new families, right? There was like the largest baby boom in the Bergen-Belsen displaced persons camp after the war. But in my mother's case, because she was so young, how did she slowly come back to life? And I didn't realize until I was starting to write what that process was like, and how hard it was being an orphan and having to make decisions for yourself, and where do you live, and then how she was, I hate to use this, it sounds so negative, but she was kind of milking the system of socialized medicine in Sweden. She was figuring things out all the time. She was trying to figure things out to her advantage and to heal. And by the time she got married and had moved to the United States, she was a very together adult who knew her mind. And so I was the beneficiary of someone who had been through a lot, but was a very strong, resilient person.
There are a lot of questions I want to ask about the process of writing the book, just all of that. But I'm wondering, before we get to that, and then also maybe opening up the questions for or the Q&A for others to ask questions and share as well. Can you share a little bit about your mom's life before the Holocaust, and maybe just some of what she went through, at least the different camps, et cetera, where she was, just so we have a little bit of background?
Yeah, so my mom was from Siget, which I visited right before the pandemic. It's beautiful. Like, I would say to my husband, oh my goodness, when, she retired and she lived out her life in North Belmore. And I was thinking, how fair is that? I mean, North Belmore is a suburb on Long Island, and there's not much you can walk to. And here she was as a kid. She grew up in this vibrant, exciting town. It was like an island surrounded by mountains, and she was a street smart kid. She was like a free range kid roaming all over town. But she had a lot of responsibility, right? Because she had a sister, a younger brother, a sister, two more came along, these little And she was the second of 6 children, really was a very big helper to her father and to her mother. And she saw, even though Siget was part of Hungary, which didn't come in, it wasn't part of the war, the Horthy Miklos, the regent, didn't want to hand over the Jews to Hitler until very late in the war. So some of the Hungarian Jews were kind of hoping the war would end before it came to them. So she felt the Holocaust on her skin from the very beginning, because even though Hungary came late to the war, certain things were happening that directly affected her family. Like in Elie Wiesel's book, Night, he talks about how in 1941, certain Jews who could not prove that they had been continual residents of Siget were deported, and no one knew what became of them. And then the time went on, months just went by, and they forgot about them. Well, my mother's family never forgot about them, because her aunts and uncles were in that first deportation. So right away, she is feeling the effects of the first 5-figure massacre of the Holocaust. That nobody knew what happened to her aunts and her uncles and her 5 little cousins under the age of 10, whom she was very close to. So right away, certain bad things are happening, and she's seeing what the grown-ups are going through. And her father was taken away to Hungarian forced labor pretty early on in 1942. So how is her mother, her mother gave birth to the 6th baby while he was away. So she is a witness to a lot of these things that are going on. And it's kind of interesting, because you're mining the memories of a 12 and 13-year-old, but she's picking up things from the environment that are very much relate to what's going on in the bigger, wider picture. An aunt and uncle escaped from Czechoslovakia, where they were deporting the Jews to Auschwitz in 1942. So she is picking up on things that are windows into a bigger story. So she had a joyful, happy, though impoverished childhood until, let's say, she was 10 years old. But from the time she was 11 years old on, it was hard to be a child. It was hard. She had a lot of chores, and she helped to run the family poultry business, and she helped her parents in big ways, and it was out of necessity. And sometimes I think that that builds a certain self-esteem, self-sufficiency. You know how to do things. She knew how to do certain things, and she could kind of take care of herself. So of course, when she arrived in Auschwitz, I think she was looking around at the older girls to take her cues from them. Like, what were people doing? Like when they were online for a selection, the women would pinch their cheeks so they would have a ruddy complexion, so make themselves look more robust and healthy. So she would, she would do certain things on her own, and certain things she would look to the older girls. What were they doing? So.
And you mentioned about the quote unquote foreign Jews, right? Who were deported, and you said your family was part of that. There was also, I believe, is it Moshe, the synagogue caretaker? He came back and was trying to warn some of the people in town, but it was so unbelievable. I think you even said that either your mother or your grandmother, I think it was, heard it, but it was so unbelievable in a sense, right? Like not even wanting to believe this, not being able to believe something like this could happen.
So this was a massacre in Kamenets-Podolsk in Ukraine. It was the first massacre of the war. If you could not prove that you were continually a resident of Hungary, you were taken away. Especially you were taken away if you had some means. And both her aunt and uncle were on the more well-to-do side. And these families disappeared, like overnight, they disappeared. And Moshe the Beadle, there's a story in Elie Wiesel's book and in mine of how this one man who was shot in the leg in this massacre stayed buried underneath the corpses of his fellow countrymen, and at night, or when the SS disappeared, or the Ukrainian guards who shot them, he scrambled out, and months later he made his way back to Siget and sounded the alarm, told everybody what was happening, Jews beware, and nobody wanted to believe him. But my but my mother witnessed him telling the story to her mother in the yard, and her mother believed him, and she like collapsed. But her grandmother could not know, could not, and they were all worried about her grandmother finding out. So someone forged letters from her aunt and uncle for her grandmother, who was illiterate. Someone had to read them to her, but they were forged letters. So she's picking up on this. She's 11 years old, and she's like 11 and 12, and every night one of the grandchildren had to sleep with the grandmother because she could not stop crying herself to sleep at night. So this is what she's witnessing as a child, how the sorrow. um, and even though the grown-ups wanted to protect the children as much as they could, certain things they could not keep from them, and especially from a kid like her. So
Yeah, she seemed very astute. You even talk about another instance when her father is taken away, right? And this incident that's happening with another group of people from the town, and he escapes and comes back. Can you share a little bit of that? Another instance with the Jewish community and a harrowing escape, and your mother hearing a little bit about this, the details.
So her father, who was, I think he was maybe 41 years old at the time, he was on the older end, but he was finally conscripted into Hungarian slave labor, which was what the Hungarians did with the young men. They did not hand them over to the Germans. They used them for their own army and put them into this slave labor for the army. Her father was a victim of, a witness to the largest massacre of Hungarian forced laborers in World War II, which happened in the spring of 1940, was it 1943? It was at the end of April. They had about 600 men who were really sick with typhus. It happened in this place called Doroshish, not far from Kiev. And they put them in this barn, or this, maybe more than one barn. I tried to read every eyewitness account, but I couldn't get it clear. And they set it on fire. They poured gasoline around the outskirts, and they set the complex on fire. And as men jumped from the burning building, the Hungarian officers had machine guns and shot them. Now, this is such a complicated story because this was at a point in the war when the Hungarian higher ups in the military wanted to treat the Hungarian Jewish men fairly. So they had to hide the incident and pretend that it was someone was smoking cigarettes and lit the barns on fire. It was an accident. Wasn't an accident, and hundreds of men were killed, either by fire or either burned or trying to escape. Somehow her father managed to escape and made it to a hospital, and her mother gets a telegram to go pick him up at this hospital. And this is like an amazing thing. Her father, after a year of being away in forced labor, her father comes home in the spring of 1943. And here she is, she's the kid, she's 13 years old, and she adored her father. She had a very close relationship with him. She was a big helper to him. And she sat by his side, sat on a stool by his side. They had a door, they put a chair and a table outside their front door. And every day through the spring and summer, people kept coming to their house, asking her father, did you see my husband? Did you see my uncle? Did you see my brother? Did you see what happened to them where they were with you? Because it was a group of men who were mostly from that region, from Siget and the surrounding area, that were part of these companies that were killed, massacred in this way. And she's sitting there next to him, just quietly listening in. And it's really kind of interesting that she's telling this story to me so many decades later, but she's remembering. It was very dramatic. And he's consoling everyone who comes. He's saying, don't worry, yes, I saw them, don't worry, they'll be okay. He was just very soft-hearted, and he just was so compassionate, and he didn't want to tell them the truth. He didn't want them to just be so bereft, but he knew the truth. And late at night, after no, the people stopped coming, some group of men from his synagogue, some older, the cronies, the guys who weren't drafted, who were maybe in their 50s or 60s. And this could have included Elie Wiesel's father because he belonged to the same synagogue. They came to the house. And again, my mother sat by his side, listening to what he was telling them. And he was telling them the truth of what happened. He was telling these men what actually took place, how they were trapped and they were surrounded, and the gasoline and the fire and the machine guns. He was telling them, and how people leapt from the building burning, and so many people were machine gunned down or burnt severely. And he's telling them, and she is just listening, and very sad, and just listening. I think maybe even she heard more than her mother heard. So for her then to not know any historical accounts, but just to tell me this story so many years later, and then I could look it up in the books, in the history books, the records, and find out the details of this massacre. So everything that she told me could be corroborated by when I looked up the greater historical context, from scholars. It's all there. Everything from the deportation to Kamenets-Podilsk to this, her aunt's escape from Czechoslovakia, to what was going on there, to this thing that happened with her father. And this is all before the deportation to Auschwitz. So her memory, it was transmitted to me, and luckily I was able to find out more details and incorporate it into her story.
Thank you. I mean, I'm just being mindful of the time, but I want to ask you so many more questions about her own experience during the Holocaust. I also want to open this up to other people to ask some questions. And I know someone also shared something prior to us starting the program, and I didn't know if that person wanted to jump on and share what they said about the picture in the book. Pauline, I believe it was. Pauline, if you want to unmute yourself, just because I'm telling you, I always say the Q&A portion is so incredible because of moments like this. Pauline, if you can share that again, it was incredible what you started to share.
Yes. I have journals from my mother and grandmother, who both survived forced labor camps in Bergen-Belsen, and my grandmother was a nurse there with Dr. Bimco Rosensoft, and met Dr. Hughes and wrote about him a little bit in her journals. But so I was researching Bergen-Belsen and came upon your book, and I think the story of Dr. Hughes is amazing. And I think that what you did in terms of juxtaposing the two stories is really beautiful. And it was a fascinating read. And then I got to page, I don't know, 176, and there's the photos of your mother in Sweden. And I recognized one of the photos because my mother has that same photo. And my mother is standing maybe 5 or 6 girls over from your mother. And it just blew me away.
Wow.
To, another confirmation for me or a little touchstone that, my mother wasn't the only one who went through this horror. My mother was 16, had just turned 16 when she was liberated. And one of the things that I would like to know, I'm trying to confirm a lot of the stories that I'm reading in my grandmother's journals, because I didn't know anything about my grandmother's life during the war. She never talked about it. But I'm curious how much Brigadier Hughes was involved with patient care, what his role was. Was he in the hospitals with the patients? Was he working more with administrators and doctors? What was his role?
So he was mostly working with organizing. He did do a little bit of patient care, but the one-on-one care was like impossible. But it was mostly triage, and it was mostly people had to have their own resources to pull through. They could give them a clean bed and food and some medicine, but it was really hard to attend to individual patients. It was a really complicated liberation. But I heard, I did hear some behind the scenes stories that never made it into my book, just where he was involved with like, he knew a patient was going to die and they wanted ice cream, so he gave them ice cream, things like small personal kind of stories. But he was at heart a doctor, so it was really eating at him to see people just die like flies. And when he knew that certain people, if they had care, could maybe pull through. But Pauline, I would love to have a conversation with you offline. So please, please, through my website, anyone can send me an email. So please let me know how to contact you. And anyone who has any questions can contact me through my website. But
I will. And I have some other photos, and I think your small group photos, and I think your mother's in some photos with my mother.
Oh, I would love to see them.
I would love to share those with you.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll be in touch. It's just such a pleasure to meet you.
Same, likewise. Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely amazing. We had a bunch of other people also saying that they're descendants of Seagate Jews, etc. So there is a connection, I'm sure. It's pretty amazing. I know Rosa had a question, so I want to maybe open up to Rosa.
What I asked was whether and how, if they affected you, how your mother's childhood experiences impacted your own childhood.
Oh, isn't it hard to sort of piece out how any of our parents' childhood experiences, went into how they parented us? Like, you're looking back, I'm looking back at this kid, but I am sure that all of, we all have this background, right? Like, what were our parents like before we entered the picture? Like, what were they like as kids? And, I thought when she raised us, I mean, it was really kind of an interesting household because, it was kind of exotic. Like, I didn't know what the Holocaust was, right? When I was a kid, I knew that she was born in Romania and that, there were a lot of Swedish things in my house. There was Swedish magazines and Swedish foods and some Hungarian foods and some of the games that she played as children, she would teach me. But she had all this that she brought to her parenting, in a way, our parents, in terms of like this, I don't know, Michael, you're a psychotherapist, but if you know better, like if someone is raised with a lot of love and comfort and affection and warmth, like that's how she parented me. She would, maybe she should have been afraid because she had TB, like she, of being contagious, but she was just very affectionate and warm and very loving and very supportive. And and when I became like a teenager and I had a teenage life that she didn't have, she loved it. I mean, she loved making parties for my friends and having sleepovers and things like that. She was very kind and supportive always. And we are so different temperamentally from each other. I mean, if she had a project to do, she had in mind she wanted to knit a sweater, she would stay up all night until that sweater was finished because she just had to see how it would turn out. Meanwhile, it took me 15 years to write a book. Like, we're just completely different, but we had a lot of mutual admiration and respect for each other. So she was wonderful, and she was not morose at all. Remember, she had those 10 post-war years in Sweden where she had some sad experiences and tough experiences, but she also had some wonderful experiences where she could come back to life. And also she had this special experience, which I talk about in the book, that really, I think, changed her as a person. She had 7 months, just 7 months in this special school for child refugees, where the teachers introduced them to culture. So she had this great love of opera. There was always classical music playing in our house. So she had this other dimension that she didn't get from Siget, right? So.
Thank you. The other thing that I was thinking, if I may, when you shared about how, after the liberations was no magic wand, it's not like everything was sorted. And even what you shared now about those few months that she had, which made up, is the connection to October 7th, and how this is not just remembering what your mother went through, but it's also a guide in a way of how to deal with the aftermath of the 7th. That, you know, that we
Yes.
don't expect
Yes.
miracles, but how much the aftercare that we have to provide. And even though I'm at a distance, I say we, because I feel deeply about it, how much it can make a difference, because it allowed the care that she was given, your mother, it allowed her to react lovingly rather, you know, than in a negative way.
Yeah.
So I think this also points the way forward to what we're going through now. So
Yeah.
thank you for that.
Yeah, I wrote an article about educating traumatized children. There's a lot about it and, you know, schools, but this is educating extremely traumatized children. So I know it was picked up by some social workers and people who work with children in educational settings. But this school was amazing for its time. And yeah, I credit the school a lot for how she turned out.
Thank you, Rosa. I think that was a beautiful question, and also tying it into what's going on today. I think it's very important that we make that connection. And I see Nina has her virtual hand raised, so I'll turn it over to Nina for the next question.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, hi. My name is Nina Goldenberg, and you don't know me at all, but we have something in common. My dad and your mom lived together in Seagate. I had the most amazing experience to speak with your mother. She was interviewed by the Names Not Numbers program here in Long Beach. She was phenomenal. She was, I don't want to use the wrong words. I don't know if I have the right words to describe the impact that she had on those students. Her ability to recall and to speak in such detail and to be a light of strength to these students. It's unbelievable what she was able to do. So she really was a miraculous woman. And as soon as I saw the video and she said she was from Seagate, I said, oh my goodness, I have to speak with her. So we spoke on the phone for like over an hour, and I never met my grandparents or my father's and my aunt, no, but I was able to speak with your mom from the town that my father was from. So that was very special for me. I probably will reach out to you if it's okay, because I would love to have some resources, maybe it's in your book, on knowing a little more about Seagate and the town that they grew up in. You spoke about it being so vibrant and the interactions, and I know some from my father from his testimony from show, but I'd like to know more about his 14 years of life before he was deported. I think your mother and my father were in that same synagogue of those 3 horrible days. There were some horrible days before they then went to the ghettos, and then from the ghettos they were departed. So there was that blew my mind, that I knew that much from his testimony when they were all, I don't want to get into it, but they were together in that moment. And you get through it to answer Rosa, because I think maybe, I don't know, but my father compartmentalized and just started anew. And that's how I was raised. Like, he wanted nothing more than for me to know nothing other than a good life. And you had to have some separation when you thought of her as a young child to know her story and write about it. And so I could just say, as a child, my father just started anew. And I guess I'll just stop babbling.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your comments. And let's be in touch. Please
I
contact.
will. Thank you.
I definitely want to have a conversation with you. I want to hear more. But yeah, it was a dream because my mother was a teenager, right? And she experienced these things through the lens of a teenager, although people had to grow up, kids had to grow up very fast if they were going to survive. I thought she could relate really well to teenagers, to kids. And it was a dream of mine that she would become, like she would speak to school groups. So I was very glad. It took her a long time, but I was very glad after my father died that she became involved with the Glen Cove Center. And she got to speak to school groups because I knew that kids would relate to her, and she would be able to help.
She was incredible with them, and they were all in awe of her and learned so much from her.
Yeah, so that's how she was with me. I mean, when I was a teenager, I mean, she was also she kind of wanted to be an American mom, but like, really, how could like you could try, she bought the, whatever, but she was psychologically, without thinking too much consciously about it, aware of what to share when. So when I was a little kid, obviously, I'm 6 and 7 years old, coming down at night and saying, asking her questions and trying to delay my bedtime. She wasn't about to tell me about the horrors of Auschwitz, right? So she told me about her childhood. She told me about some adventures in Sweden. And that was, again, one of the learnings of in writing her story. I didn't realize how hard she had it because she put such a positive spin on some of these things. But only when I was at the age she was, when she went through some of the really horrors like Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, then she'd be in the laundry room late at night ironing. I'd keep her company, and she would be telling me things. And then she would say, I don't want to give you nightmares, but, and then she'd step away from the ironing board and stretch her arms out behind her and demonstrate for me how she, who was 50% dead, dragged bodies, skeletal people to a mass grave at Bergen-Belsen, and some of them were still breathing. And these are things that were, they didn't give me nightmares, but they were certainly more compelling and shocking than anything I was learning in social studies in school. So they stayed with me. Like anything that she told me about the war kind of lodged in my brain. I'll forget a lot of other things, but
I only knew what was being taught in high school, and I only understood that level of what she was explaining in the laundry room when I went to see Schindler's List, and I was 25 years old, and I went, wait a minute, my 6 foot 200-pound dad was a skeleton in that camp, and I couldn't put it together anyway. So then I only learned I'm so grateful. I said, you have to call 1-800-SHOA Foundation and do your testimony. And he struggled and he struggled, and he eventually did it.
those testimonies, I think, was Steven Spielberg did such a great thing in capturing those testimonies. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Nina, for bringing that into the conversation. Something that reminds me of two things. Number one, I think maybe 3 or 4 times, Bernice, you mentioned your mother's age in the book. And, I'm glad you did, because I kept on thinking she had to be older to go through this, so it just brought me back that she was 14, 15, 16 when I'm reading some of these things. And it was just shocking. And it really brought me back to what was actually going on, right? I'm reading this story essentially, but the truth and the person behind it. So that jolted me every time I saw her age, because I would forget, with everything that she was witnessing and everything that was going on, that she was there 14, 15, 16. So Nina mentioned also the walk where they went from one synagogue and then switched to another, the ghetto, and then deportation. Would you mind sharing a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the first thing that happened, first of all, the Hungarians divided the region of Hungary, the officials, into 6 zones. And my mother and Nina's father were part of the zone 1. And that was the zone that was closest to the liberating Russian army that was making progress during the war. And it was also the area that it was easiest to get rid of Jews, because these were Jews who were Yiddish Jews. they were not assimilated. And so it was easier for the population to accept that they had to be moved. And my mother was really lucky because the boundaries of the ghetto, her street fell within. So she didn't have to move to a ghetto. The people from the outskirts, from the surrounding area, came to where she was. And because she already lived in such a crowded, cramped, little tiny apartment, nobody moved in with them. So during the weeks in the ghetto, I talk about it in the book, life is kind of fun for a kid, right? There's no school, it's vacation, there's not much you can do. And, you know, so she's roaming around and playing in the gardens, and the grown-ups were treating the children very nicely. So that was her experience. And of course it was, while the adults were very busy preparing for who knows what, you know, for being taken away. And then the horrors began.
Can you share the time, so when she was with her mother, the split between her family members and how that happened?
Yeah. So she didn't tell me till after the book was published. Like, she didn't. So many times I asked her like these sad details, tragic details. She didn't tell me until after the book was published that she wanted to go with her mother in Auschwitz. Like, that was the natural thing. She didn't want to be separated from her mother when they had the separations on the ramps. And this was part of the complication of arriving in the ramps in Auschwitz-Birkenau, because my mother was 14 and my father had a 14-year-old sister. And she was, in the birth order of the family, she was the second to youngest. So she went with her mother. Her older sister said, go with her mother. But because my mother was the second to the oldest and her sister was 16, she had to go with her older sister. So there's this fateful moment and during these macabre selections and obscene selections in Auschwitz. But she didn't tell me till after that she had originally, like, her first instinct was to go with mommy, but she had to go with her older sister.
And your mother had last words for her mother had last words for your mother, right? And her father did as well, right? If I
Well, it was
recall.
mostly her father in the cattle wagon. So here they were a poor family, like, and anything material had been taken away from the Jews anyway. So what gift could her father give her on the cattle wagon on the way to Auschwitz? Like, so he gave her, I mean, he said to her, you know, he realized when they passed Košice, which was Kasha, which was the gateway to Poland, then they realized where they were being taken. And he, having been out in the war, had an inkling of what was going on. So he turned to her and he said, I know that you're a strong girl and that you're going to make it. I know, you know, he didn't have any gift to give her, but he gave her the gift of words of confidence. And really, it really stayed with her. And at the end of the war in Bergen-Belsen, when she's fighting for her life, like every day in this makeshift hospital room, there's 12 beds. Every day for 3 weeks, 11 are taken out dead and 11 are nearly dead or brought in to fill those beds. She's saying to herself, all these things are coming back to her. And she said, I have to survive. My father believed in me. He believed I was going to make it.
And it seems like there were so many instances where your mother and her sister, in a way, having that relationship kept them both alive. And then when they separated, there was worry about each other and having to survive so they can see the other and be with the other after. It was another almost like race against the time moments within this book that keep on waiting to see when are they going to see each other again. And even after liberation, there was this constant moving around, being separated. For example, when they went to Sweden and one went on one boat versus the other boat and then having to meet up again after, or then having to be in the tuberculosis unit and separating, then coming back and then just wanting to spend all of this time together. It was incredible. Every time these moments happen, you're feeling it like you're there. You wrote it beautifully.
They were kids. They didn't know to advocate to be together. And there was, yeah, and you know, that was their destiny. My mother in post-war lived in New York. My mother, her sister lived in California. I mean, their destiny was not to be together somehow. But at the moment that it meant the most existentially was the moment in Auschwitz where my mother was picked for the gas chamber and my aunt was picked to live. And how they finagled things to be together was really revealed a lot about my aunt.
Yeah.
They were partners. It was very hard to survive alone. It wasn't impossible. It happened in instances, but mostly it was very helpful to have at least one partner, you know, in survival. Trying.
It seems like
I-
there were a couple of them.
I know I should raise my hand, but I have to jump in because I'm afraid I'll forget. If I have to tell you how proud your mother was of you when we spoke. She told me about you, about the books that you wrote, and oh gosh, I hope I'm not wrong. Do you have children?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
And how grateful she was to have the life that she had and to have you and to be a grandmother. And I just had to express that, her pride in all that you've done in honor of her.
Thank you.
So let the rules be known that Nina, anytime anyone wants to share about a parent cavelling over their child, you can interrupt anything that's happening. That's always welcomed here.
I think the survivors were by and large, enormously proud of the lives they built after, of their children.
I think someone also had a question about, and Allison asked, just to go back to the book a little bit, were you able to interview Glenn Hughes's family or descendants, and how you were able to connect with them, and how that contributed to telling the story?
Yeah. So that was a challenge, and it was hard because I had to try to find descendants, and you know, I learned from who's who and certain bios that he had a daughter, 2 daughters and a son, and one daughter was alive and in London, and how many, and I didn't know her married name, and how many Hugheses are in the phone book. You know, so I basically tracked them down. I did crazy things. I was obsessed with this man. I wrote to every organization he had ever been a part of, and serendipitously his his daughter and son-in-law were bringing his books into his alma mater. They were donating them, so I got in touch with her. I went to visit her in London. I spoke and corresponded with his son, who was in Spain, and I met the grandchildren, which was a whole other thing. He had a ceremony in London where he was posthumously honored by Yad Vashem UK, and his grandchildren learned for the first time who their grandfather was. They had no idea.
That's incredible. And you mentioned that there was no biography about him before. Any understanding of why there was no mention of him to that large extent? I mean, for what I read in your book, he did so much to save people from death and did so much to make these things happen with hospitals.
Yeah, and he was, any one of you who've had experience with hospice movement, he was really an inspiration to Cicely Saunders, who founded the St. Christopher's Hospice, and I directly related that to his experience of being unable to save people from horrible deaths. So no, I came across in his files, there's a couple of people who interviewed him and wrote little essays, but nothing published about his life before my book.
And sort of along the same line, you include family testimony and research. So were you able to find out more about your own family doing this? Were there things that you didn't know before that you were able to find out?
It is really hard. The Hungarian Jews, there must be records somewhere, but I was unable to find out too much. Mostly, I mean, it was my mother's stories that were windows to larger things. It was very hard to try. I mean, I found papers. I don't know precisely, like I think that my grandparents were killed immediately upon arriving in Auschwitz, but then I found a record with someone with my grandfather's name who was in Mauthausen, but I'm not sure, like some things matched up and some things didn't. So this is unfinished business for some of us who are 2Gs and 3Gs. We don't know exactly precisely what happened. And, consequently, our, survivors couldn't really mourn their parents' deaths. And it's weird because my mother, when my father died, it was our first experience with death in the family. We didn't know anything about how to select a gravestone or what does it mean to have an unveiling. We had this, it's just in survivor families, these people evaporated and you just don't know all the details of how they died. And
Yeah, how many stories get left untold?
untold.
Yeah.
But you can get hints from the literature and from listening to a lot of survivor testimonies.
Yeah. Another set of questions. Did your mother ever find family besides her sister after the war? Who did she find? Did she ever go back to Seagate? And I'll add to that because of reading the book, I know the family buried some of their possessions. Was that ever recovered?
She never went back to Siget. She never recovered anything. She found like an aunt through marriage in Sweden. No other relatives. She did search. At one point, she went to Israel and she looked up everyone who was Ginuth. She had this question in her mind, like not exactly survivor's guilt, but she had all these young uncles, young, strong uncles in their 30s. Like, why didn't they survive? Like, how did she, a kid who survived? But she never found anyone. I mean, sometimes she would say she felt like she was born from a stone. And once in Israel, she met someone who knew her mother, and that meant so much to her. But she remembers she was a kid and she wasn't very much part of circles. Had she been part of the Siget survivor community, she might have had more people. But she really didn't. She didn't.
And speaking of which, being so young when she was liberated, and then after growing up in Sweden for a little bit after the war, did she have any mentors or teachers who helped her on that path to adulthood?
Yes, mostly at that school. Yeah. And yeah, she had, she at that school that she had amazing teachers who had been survivors, but also like just she encountered kindness and caring. Like in that picture that was referred to about Katrina Holm, that was the first doctor who gave her personalized, individualized medical attention, who stayed up with her all night when she had her fever spiked and she was sick and dying. So Sweden was very healing. I have not heard a single survivor account that didn't speak highly about their experience when they were taken to Sweden.
And speaking of healing, you mentioned the Marx Brothers being prescribed to your mother. I think that's a nice vignette. If you want to share that, a little bit about that moment, and then Pauline, I see, has her hand
So
raised.
she was depressed, like you see in the cover of the picture in the cover of the book. And you see later in the book other pictures of her as a young lady, smiling as a young adult. But so she went to a doctor at one point. Another thing that happened in her life was that all her friends were going to Palestine. Like, people wanted to go to Israel where it became a country. And she went to be examined by a doctor and she was too sick. She couldn't get in. And she was really down. And the doctor told her, listen, he said, you look so depressed. Like, she didn't have therapy or anything, or, she probably had PTSD, but they didn't know about that. But so he said, you have to learn to laugh again. You have to cheer yourself up. Go see Marx Brothers movies. And these things helped her. These little bits of advice helped her.
And Pauline, if you want to share.
Yes, I'm curious about what you learned about the education in Sweden, and how all these young survivors were kind of brought out of their shells and taught to. I mean, you mentioned culture, but there must have been. I just can't even imagine the challenges of of reentry for these young people?
So the Swedish government realized they took in about 7,000 really sick survivors, aiming to rehabilitate them and also hope that they would be repatriated. Like that was the thing after the war. Everyone hoped that the survivors would just go back to their countries of origin, which was of course impossible for at least for those in most of the people. Few went back to Eastern Europe. A few did, but not many. Anyway, so these schools were set up, and there must have been something like between 10 and 15 of them. They were small and they weren't all of the same character. But the one she went to happened to be organized and run by the man who was in charge of all these refugee children. And they decided that those who were not yet 18, they had to give them some form of schooling before they turned them out into the world. So they set up these schools, and she went to this small school, maybe 50 to 60 girls, and their aim, they didn't give them vocational skills or training for jobs after. Their aim was to turn them to see that the world didn't only have terrible things in store for them. So that was her experience, and I write about it in the book. And actually what was so amazing was that the head of the school, this man named Eli Gatroy, was doing his doctoral thesis on the school. So he wrote this, like, I don't know, 100-page thesis in Swedish. And I was able to find it, and only like 2 libraries in the whole world had it. And it was in a library in Germany. And I got a copy of it. And my mother, she was like in her early 80s. She took her a few months, but she translated the whole thing for me from Swedish into English. And it was very interesting to hear from the headmaster's perspective about some of the crazy things these girls were doing. And a lot of them had crushes on him, and it was a big story. But it was very interesting. And he did this post survey about what this school community did for these young women. And he asked them to write these essays, and he selected 5 for his dissertation, and my mother's was one of them. So she had fun translating it. It was a real labor of love for her, and it was a great help to me because I could include a lot of the information about this school in the book.
Wonderful.
In the epilogue.
Can you share a little bit about how your mother and father met?
So now I'm writing about my father. So I'm realizing how all the, the things that happened in their past that sort of brought them together. But basically, his sisters met her sister at a party in the United States. Her sister left for the United States after she got married, and she promised my mother she would bring her out within 1 year. And my mother thought, oh yeah, that's a pipe dream. Like, that's going to happen. Like, how are you going to bring me out? Well, she found this man who was willing to go to Sweden to meet her and marry her. And that was my father. And that was so out of character for my father. But that's what happened. And yeah, and they were a great match. It was just a luck thing.
Wow, that's amazing. And I'm glad. That was another question, is will you be writing a book about him as well, or at least share his testimony? So I'm happy to hear that that's a yes.
Yeah.
Just another question. Your mother, as we said, recently passed away. How has your approach to Holocaust education or sharing her testimony changed since then?
It hasn't really changed. I've been doing book talks, authors talks, and of course, when she was alive, we did some talks together, which was really nice. And I miss her terribly, because anything that happened, anything from a movie or a television show or a political event, I would always call her and get her opinion. But I'm lucky because I had her for so many years, and her words stay with me. And it would be really, I'm glad that she's not here to see what happened on October 7th and then what happened after that, because the anti-Semitism, the explosions of anti-Semitism were upsetting to her even when she was alive, and she saw things happen in Malmo, Sweden, her beloved Sweden, or in France. And she was a really great Zionist and very pro-Israel, and so proud of the Jewish people and what they accomplished in the state of Israel. And she would be devastated by some of the things that are going on now. So, but I know I know what her reaction would be because I have this bank of memories of how she reacted to things in the past.
I just want to open up again for anyone else who has any other questions or comments. I already see a lot of comments. People are saying thank you. I think that goes for all of us. This has been such an incredible
Yeah.
presentation, and I wanted to ask, Sharon, it looks like wants to share something, and then maybe I'll ask for some parting words. I mean, this has been absolutely incredible. And to tie it into October 7th, I do appreciate that, because I do wonder how survivors would respond to such a thing, and how that has impacted us as educators, as descendants of survivors, etc. So yeah. So Sharon, let me turn it over to you.
I'll just say hi to Bernice. We've known each other. So also my father had two sisters who were sent to Birkenau and then to Bergen-Belsen. And I think it did make a big difference to have two people together, whether two siblings, to help support each other. But the tragic irony is that these two sisters survived and at Bergen-Belsen, and then the older one was recovering from typhus, and she was poisoned by a German nurse who was working with the Red Cross. So then after that, my aunt, who was my father's twin, also went to Sweden. I'm pretty sure she was in Göteborg. Is that where your mom was? Was it in Göteborg?
No.
No. So I don't know if they were in the same place or not. I think that's, but were they all spread out around Sweden, or in
They went through an intake process, and then they were sent to different hospitals all over the country.
to different? Oh, okay. I don't know a lot of detail, but she was there for 2 years and then came to the US because they had an aunt who had come before World War I who sponsored. My father had to wait until 49. And he was also in Hungarian slave labor. They were from Czechoslovakia, but the area that was, I don't know about when you talk about the zones, the area that was taken over by Hungary, that was Czechoslovakia and the Carpathian Mountains. So there's a lot of similarities, and they were also teenagers, a little bit older than your mother, a few years older. And I just think the rise of anti-Semitism, my parents would have just been so devastated. I mean, my mother died almost 30 years ago at age 70 from cancer. My father died 20 years ago, but I think they would have just been absolutely so devastated, because they thought always believed that America is a safe place, and Israel, of course, al hakama v'kama, but that this could never happen here. And to see after what happened in Charlottesville, and especially the murders in Pittsburgh, and all this rise of anti-Semitism, one thing, I'm just grateful that they weren't alive anymore to see that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I would love also to chat with you
Yeah.
further.
Yeah,
I'd love
yeah,
to hear
yeah.
about your father's experiences, and some of the people who wrote in the chat. I mean, Judy,
Yeah.
that her mother was in Bergen-Belsen and she was born in the DP camp. I want to hear more. So the research and it's a lot of my work is driven by my curiosity. Could be nosy. I could be sort of the nasty girl, but that's what I think. Like someone said to me, "Oh, you're courageous to have written this." No, it's more about being curious.
Thank you. I want to ask maybe if you have any final message to share with us, either that you would share or what your mother would want to share, to close us out.
Oh, well, Michael, thank you so much for doing this. I'm so proud of you and the other 3Gs who were involved and carrying the torch. And we're all just aware that we're only here for a short time. And the 2Gs are witnesses to the witnesses, but how great when the 3Gs take up the mantle. And I'm very grateful. And my mother would always tell school groups, she said, always would say things like, use your education to do good, and know that if you're going through a really difficult time in your life, you can pull through it and things can look better and sunnier tomorrow. So Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bernice. You know, as you said it, I was trying to imagine your mother saying it with her accent, because it reminds me so much of my family, and it's I could just feel it and hold on to that. I thank you so much for your time, for everything you do. Your book is incredible. Your presentation and how you share so candidly. So thank you, and thank you to everyone for being here. I hope to see you all again Sunday, March 10th. We'll be speaking with a survivor, and I just want to thank you all again. Take care, be well, have a good night.
You.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Good night.